Hey, this two-part series on the Joker franchise is a cinema essay that was done by my friend Rob, and was based entirely by an intriguing conversation over the phone about the research I had found out about the character Joker. But Rob took it one step further, and this is his interpretation, which I wanted to support. The concept was first forged by myself, the research was done by both of us, the final written piece was done by him, and now it's narrated by me. So, this is two takes, and this is his shot. A cinema essay done by Rob, and I really hope you enjoy it. Nobody scares me like the Joker. He may not be a horror movie villain like Michael Myers or Freddy Krueger, or even the likes of Hannibal Lecter, but the Joker frightens me on a level that few fictional characters can reach. One that isn't limited to the act of merely watching his films. Whether we're looking at a director's intentions behind the camera, or the way in which we moviegoers consume the Joker's screen presence, there seems to be a disturbing relationship between he and us. And through this link, the clown has been allowed to show us his frightening ability to transcend the confines of character and operate as something greater, something far more enduring and extensive than simply flesh and blood. A concept is a slippery thing. It can be easy to unleash and difficult to contain. When it finds a host, it can infect or even be taught, and when it takes effect, it can either corrupt or inspire. Give somebody an idea, and if they're susceptible enough, they may just well run with it. To explore the ways in which the Joker can function as such a thing, I'm going to be looking strictly at his three biggest outings in cinema, all of which were smash hits that had enormous lasting impact on our pop culture. Tim Burton's Batman, Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, and Todd Phillips' Joker. I suspect one of the reasons the Joker continues to leave his mark on pop culture is a steady reflection of our own anxieties. It's become clear to me that these three cinematic versions of him were all heavily influenced, consciously and not, by the zeitgeists at the times in which they were made, and I suppose if you were to look at these versions from afar, they could be brushed off as mere products of their time, but with closer inspection and context, they can reveal themselves to be reflections, something far more deliberate and potent. Essentially, to examine these versions of the Joker under a microscope is to flick through the pages of a history book on our own collective anxieties at specific moments in time. Casting Jack Nicholson in 1989 helped give Tim Burton's Batman a sense of legitimacy and its place in the pantheon of iconic blockbusters. But as time has gone on, the general view of Nicholson's performance has become less enthusiastic, now often being equated with the more on-the-nose campiness of the 60s Batman comedy show. But it's really his function within the film that keeps it standing, and for the first time, this Joker operated as less as a standard villain of the week for Batman to foil, and more as a disturbing answer to the 80s obsession with wealth and power. This Joker spends his time teetering between something of a public villain who poisons the city in various ways, and a public figure who denies his wrongdoings, disrupts businesses, and lures Gotham citizens to their deaths, with a street parade of free money while he dances to the sound of Prince's Trust, no doubt. In the 60s, the Joker was portrayed on the screen merely as a thorn in Batman's side, a criminal who leapt and cackled and plotted harmless schemes. So it's interesting that for this movie, made at the tail end of the 80s, Burton chose to place his Joker in the shoes of a public-speaking crime boss, one with sinister motives but who positions himself as a tycoon flirting with the city's politics. And when I think of Nicholson in his well-pressed purple suits and thick winter overcoats, I can't help but be reminded of one of the most influential and notorious public figures from that era. Donald Trump's rise to power as a businessman in the 70s and 80s was something that was vilified yet romanticized by both the press and the public. On one hand, building skyscrapers and golf courses was seen as defacing the classic beauty of New York. But on the other hand, consuming hotels and casinos was as glamorous as you could get. and was something many wanted a taste of. As he conquered Manhattan, some would have followed his cash-coloured footsteps into the world of business, while others couldn't help see pieces of him within the villain characters of the time, such as Gordon Gekko in the film Wall Street, claiming,
"I am not a destroyer of companies. I am a liberator of them." The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
With this in mind, the front cover of Trump's famous book from the 80s, The Art of the Deal, in which he's posed with an expensive haircut and inviting smile, could remind some of Nicholas's Joker seducing Gotham on the evening news. This Joker speaks of money and notoriety. He keeps a mistress in a top-floor penthouse, carries with him a fierce appreciation of art and style, and executes his plans through lies and false promises. Such were the obsessions of the 80s, the era of plenty. When a character in this film directly asks him what he wants, the Joker's response rings true.
My face on the $1 bill.
Things were given a high shot of adrenaline when Christopher Nolan released The Dark Knight in 2008, a movie that made him a household name, broke all kinds of box office records, and even sparked talk of Oscar nominations at a time when that was inconceivable for a superhero film. It was a water cooler moment for my generation. Everyone went to see The Dark Knight, and everyone loved it. And of course, the first thing out of everyone's mouths was the overwhelming and unanimous praise for Heath Ledger's standout performance. It was a role that became legendary from day one, creating gossip around his untimely death, but bringing everyone together to be in on the joke with their friend, relative, or co-worker, inevitably quoted,
Why so serious?
But by the late 2000s, a piano was hanging over our heads in the shape of urban terrorism. The start of the decade had been ignited with the September 11 attacks, and things just seemed to cascade from there, with waves of bombings and shootings from front-page news every couple of years, all while the United States fought the war on terror. Nolan was conscious of this, as was Ledger. Apparently, when the two initially met to discuss Ledger playing the part, they were shocked to find that they shared exactly the same idea: to mould their Joker as a modern-day terrorist in a film that sees desperate, questionable tactics, such as coercive interrogations and mass surveillance, as the only means to stop him. For The Dark Knight, the concept of chaos was truly embraced to allow the character to cut deep. Ledger's Joker doesn't care about wealth or style or any form of personal gain, a point that Nolan even underlines when the Joker literally sets fire to the 10-foot pile of cash. Ledger famously applied his own makeup to give himself that chaotic, slapped-together look of someone who considers his appearance as secondary to his actions. The shabbiness of his greasy hair and stingy clothes was modelled on British punk singers Sid Vicious and Johnny Rotten, while his mannerisms were influenced by the brutality of Malcolm McDowell's performance in A Clockwork Orange. Much like the bombers and shooters people heard about in the 2000s, this Joker is harder to understand, harder to pin down. In the film, when Bruce Wayne is confused over the Joker's apparent lack of motive, Alfred tells him about his own past experience hunting a motiveless criminal in the Burmese jungle.
Some men aren't looking for anything logical, like money. They can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. Some men just want to watch the world burn.
That couldn't be more true of this version, a force of nature who appears driven by a primal urge to set fire to the structural world, just to prove that it's easier to do than you might think. Throughout the film, we know, logically, that the Joker must reside somewhere in the city, but, cleverly and creepily, the film never shows us his base of operations, which makes the anticipation of his attacks feel more like waiting on a predator that's lurking somewhere in the tall grass. And when he does appear, he blows in like the wind, wreaks havoc, then vanishes with a heap of fire, smoke and rubble in his wake. In his own words,
Introduce a little anarchy.
like some of those who have died willingly to carry out their attacks in our own world, the Dark Knight's Joker demonstrates on multiple occasions that he doesn't fear death and that it can't be used against him. As Batman tries to physically beat answers out of him during a brutal interrogation, the Joker simply throws his head against the wall in a fit of laughter and boasts, "You have nothing. Nothing to threaten me with. Nothing to do with all of your strength." After all, what can be done when a threat can't be stopped with force? When your enemy turns your biggest strength into a weakness? By burrowing deep into our collective fear of terrorism at a time when it felt inevitable, this interpretation of the Joker was something many audiences latched onto, partially, I suspect, because it was a version of the news that we finally had some control over. The word toxicity comes to mind when I think of the most recent film, Joker. That was what Joker was largely about, and that was what Joker, ironically, riled up in many people. By the time it was released in 2019, it was a significant lack of separation between entertainment and political discourse. Gone were the days of The Dark Knight taking influence from our headlines for effective storytelling. It was now that a film was seen as either for or against any respective argument, and one's verdict on that determined their view of the film's worth and quality. I suspect Todd Phillips was very aware of this. Right down to the film's conception, there was a crucial difference here in how this legendary villain was suddenly positioned as our protagonist, our hero, to follow and root for. But Phillips went about this in a way that made it impossible to ignore. By stripping away the character's usual traits of high status and evil plots, he instead infused him with sympathetic topical issues. By this time in our culture, the biggest discussion being held was that of identity, a discussion that involved the topic of mental health, government criticism, and hot-button phrases like oppression and victim. This Joker is presented as such, a man named Arthur, lost amid an identity crisis and numbed to the bone with heavy medication, who gets beaten and verbally abused on a regular basis, whose therapy is terminated by budget cuts, and whose violent fantasies are bursting at the seams. Despite the red flags in his alarming behaviour, he's presented very much as a downtrodden, unlucky underdog who reminds me of Charlie Chaplin's classic character of the Tramp. In fact, the comparison between Arthur and the Tramp couldn't have been lost on Phillips, who even incorporated a scene here in which Arthur gatecrashes a screening of Chaplin's Modern Times and grins like a child during one of the Tramp's great comedy routines. Even Phoenix's performance is Chaplin-esque, being very physical and bumbling, almost to the point of slapstick comedy. The creative parting of Phillips and Phoenix was the perfect mixture to put Joker together. Against all odds, they managed to form a sympathetic view of a character we've always known as a maniacal villain, doing so through their use of the 2009 zeitgeist and framing Arthur in the conversation of the moment, a conversation that prioritized the freedom to speak my truth. And boy, did Arthur do just that. But there were those who saw Joker differently, who were worried about his intentions and what may come of them. The debate around Joker actually introduced me to the internet term incel, which is used online to refer to the many mass shooters in America who often been revealed to be white, male loners, lashing out against society. And some people were afraid that due to Arthur's actions being reminiscent of some of these incel attacks, the film was either a deliberate call to arms for those individuals, or at least set them off. This was a concern, in fact, that some news broadcasts warned moviegoers against the potential threat of attacks within the cinemas, often bringing up the 2012 shooting in Aurora, Colorado, in which a so-called incel opened fire during a screening of The Dark Knight Rises. Certain story beats in Joker were directly influenced by a real-life shooting that occurred in 1984. While riding the subway in New York, a white male in his 30s named Bernard Getz was approached by 4 young black men, one of whom simply asked him, "Can I have $5?" Getz then brandished a handgun and shot all 4 of them. They all survived, one of them was paralyzed. The incident became something of a media puzzle, with some supporting Getz' actions as a symbol of their growing frustrations with crime rates in the city, whilst others saw it simply as a racist attack, as the evidence didn't point to any wrongdoing from any of the 4 victims, no matter how much Getz tried to explain that he thought he was being mugged. We're presented with the same puzzle in Joker. Are any of Arthur's actions justified? Because the film wants us to sympathise with him, his shooting of the men on the subway is presented as much less of a grey area than its real-life inspiration. And here, They're drunk Wall Street men, being abusive towards anyone they stumble across, and their races will probably change from their real-life counterparts to avoid any question of racism in Arthur's part. But however you view Joker, whether it be dangerous or liberating, or as merely an effective psychodrama, it essentially acts as a cautionary tale to society, a push for us all to do better. It's Todd Phillips' way of shouting from a hilltop with a bullhorn, warning us that without change, the end could be nigh. What are your thoughts on what was discussed in this episode? Comment and let me know to open up a conversation. Like and subscribe for more content of this nature, and come talk to me on Twitter or Instagram. Better yet, support the show on my Patreon to help a creator such as myself with learning on the go. Each like, each comment, each subscriber fuels the motivation I need to make better and better content for yours truly. Come say hi, and thanks for watching.